States are preparing to take a little more responsibility over the food stamp program thanks to congressional changes to the safety net. But does this reform signal a bigger movement toward more federalism in the social welfare system? And if so, is it a good thing?
We have to demand that our state leaders, both at the state level and the ones we send to Washington to represent us, we've got to demand that they are the voice for federalism.
On this episode, we explore one of the practical ways the One Big Beautiful Bill redefines the relationship between states and the federal government when it comes to feeding the poor and helping them move back toward work-based self-reliance. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week I'm very happy to have back in our virtual studio Tony Woodlief with the Center for Practical Federalism at the State Policy Network. Tony, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Nick.
Tony, I'm excited to talk to you because one of the big themes that I think we've been talking about over the last year and coming into the new year is this idea of federalism. And kind of the first, I guess, thesis I want to test with you to kind of start off a conversation. We'll talk about some of the reforms to the social welfare programs at the federal level and what that means for kind of the balance between the federal government and states when it comes to responsibility in administering these programs. But first, because of all these conversations and the debates in 2025 about the One Big Beautiful Bill and the work requirements and how we administer social welfare programs to help address poverty, the big thing that's been on my mind is that I feel really strongly we need a lot more federalism across the board with all kinds of policy issues. I really think that if we were able to sort of push more decision-making and ownership of issues out of the federal government to the states, I think in many instances we'll have better policy outcomes and we'll reduce political polarization because it won't feel quite so existential. I feel that especially strongly with the social welfare system. I just want to toss that out. Is that right? Is that wrong? How would you approach that issue as we think about how we work on these issues in the new year?
Well, it won't surprise you somebody who works with the Center for Practical Federalism is in favor of your idea. There's so many challenges, like when the government shut down, federal government, for a number of weeks. I think many of us heard this statistic that maybe was surprising. It should be surprising that you have 42 million people on food stamps. 42 million people, and if you're familiar at all with that federal program, which for the longest time it's just money that comes from we taxpayers, goes to Washington, gets layered with a bunch of rules designed to make sure that nobody ever gets out of that cycle of poverty, and then the money's thrown back out to the states. And the states have very minimal investment in that. So it's the worst possible system, in my opinion, because people in Washington, some of whom I think at some level they actually want more dependency, they're the ones setting the rules for how we take care of the poor in our own states. And it's inefficient. You can't, with a lot of these programs, you can't even use the money to test whether the program works, right? The federal government forbids it. So just from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't make any sense that we do it that way. And if you have federalism, you have more options to try it differently. There are different ways to feed people. And I think if you have more control closer to home, the average American does not want to see generation after generation in the same family dependent on strangers to feed them, right? Assuming that it's not generation after generation of complete disability that makes them unable to feed themselves, because we all want to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. But we see generations of people who won't take care of themselves. And the programs that we've designed in Washington, it's almost like they're intentionally created to make sure people never get out of that cycle. So it's not only efficiency then, but it's compassion, because it's not compassionate to keep people permanently dependent on government. That's the opposite of compassion. And, when I saw that 42 million number, I thought, my goodness, something's not right,
Tony, that resonates with me a lot because we've talked a lot on this show in the past about the need to reform our social welfare system, that really this vision that should be broadly popular, should be adopted by all of us. And I think if you were to poll Americans, they would agree with this, that the goal of the social welfare system should be to provide some temporary help to alleviate material suffering, provide some stability for folks who are struggling, while helping them move back towards work-based self-reliance. And in my view, it seems like sometimes it's hard to get that right with these programs from the federal government. So we need the states to sort of own their role as innovators, as leaders, and we should pursue policy reforms that help make that more possible. And it seems like that's one of the things that happened in the 2025 passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. We talked a lot in previous episodes about the work requirements portion of that bill when it comes to Medicaid and SNAP. But there's a recent report from October 2025 from the Alliance for Opportunity with the Center for Practical Federalism by Les Ford. She's great. We've had her on the show a number of times. But I want to ask you about it because this report we'll link to in the show notes called What States Can Expect with the New SNAP Match, Options to Reduce State Error Rates. So, Tony, I wonder if you could give us an overview and recognizing that if you go to the general public and say, hey, we're going to talk about food stamp error rates, that sounds really dry and kind of wonky. But there's a bigger sort of governance principle at play here that seems important to me. So can you kind of give us your thoughts, broadly speaking, on a high level, what is happening with this new legislation that's been passed? What are states going to face down the line when this stuff gets implemented?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that report because it's ready-made for policymakers in states who want to adjust their programs while they still have time. Because the OB3, the One Big Beautiful Bill, it's going to have real penalties for states that are not administering the food stamp program properly. And so the backstory is the Biden administration for 4 years went out of their way to pressure states not to do proper eligibility checks. And states had little incentive to resist that because the federal government's footing the bill for the food stamps. And so we know that that meant that millions of people began to access benefits who are not eligible. They don't meet the requirements, but they're getting it anyway. And that was by design out of the Biden White House. And so now what the OB3 does is it says, well, you have to fix that. So only a handful of states, I think Utah is one of them, have administered their programs properly all along. And so they don't really face this big penalty. But other states, like my state of North Carolina, faces a $530 million annual penalty starting, I think, in 2028 if they don't fix their program. So in a nutshell, it's trying to create an incentive for states to do the responsible thing, which they would do if they were footing the bill in the first place. Back to your point about federalism, they have to start doing the responsible thing and do proper eligibility checks and make sure that they're not issuing these payments to people who can provide for themselves. It's that simple. It's just immoral, to spend, especially $38 trillion federal debt, to be spending all this money for people who were never eligible to receive those benefits in the first place. It wasn't intended for them. So that's probably one of the biggest changes. And so that report that you referenced, it just has some practical steps that any state could take to begin fixing their error rate immediately. And they still have time before those penalties start to kick in, but they only have about one more year. And so what we found is a number of states, when you talk to lawmakers, they're kind of surprised. They don't even realize that this tsunami is coming, and it is a massive fiscal hit for a lot of states. A lot of them Republican controlled. So our hope is they get their houses in order pretty quickly.
Tony, we need to take a break in a couple minutes, but I want to close the loop on something, because when you talk about SNAP error rates, from the report, just one of the top line findings says that the food stamp error rate is far too high. Between 2013 and 2024, the food stamp error rate more than tripled from 3.2% to 10.93%. I know you mentioned that there were some decisions from the Biden administration. Do you have any sense of, that seems pretty dramatic to go to triple the food stamp error rate. And when you put it in the context of what you're saying, that Americans, I think, are compassionate people. We are blessed with a vibrant free enterprise system that allows us to have some resources as a country to help those who struggle. And I think Americans support that, broadly speaking, but we want it to be administered well and accurately. So a tripling of the error rate does seem pretty concerning. Can you give any thoughts into how did we get to that point over the last 10 to 12 years, and why you think this shift in the federal legislation with sort of pulling in states, maybe forcing states, hey, you need to have a stronger seat at the table to help us get this right. Why does that feel like a good step forward?
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed out that time range because pretty much any bad idea we saw out of the Biden White House, they learned from the Obama administration, and so they were kind of applying similar pressure back when they had power, and they states had an incentive to just roll over because if the way the program has been structured, the state is going to foot at least some of the cost for its um, administration of the program, including eligibility checks. And so the state could essentially just not bother to check eligibility, just trust whatever income people write down when they file for benefits. And then the feds are going to write the checks essentially. They send the money to the states can write the checks. So there was no incentive, back to the federalism incentive. If you're sloppy like that as a state and your taxpayers are footing the bill, number one, they're going to be mad about all the taxes they're paying. Number two, layabouts from other surrounding states who can't get a check that easily where they are, they're just going to come live in your state and let you feed them. So it's an attempt to try to create an incentive to manage the program properly. Because as we know, any of us, especially we have teenagers, right? If you're not the person footing the bill, sometimes you can be a little more careless with the resources, whether it's the gas in the car, the family car, or the snacks in the pantry, or in this case, food stamp benefits.
Well, Tony, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about what this means for states in a little more detail. The report also contemplates some things that states should be thinking about or states should do. So I want to kind of ask you, that was a good summary on kind of here's what's been happening on the federal side. Now what is about to or what should happen on the state side as this gets implemented. And as states, again, maybe have a little bit more of a sense of ownership over some of these programs that ultimately should hopefully lead to good innovations and reforms and how we help people get out of poverty and reach for the American dream through upward mobility. So we'll dive into all of that. Again, we're going to take a quick break. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation with Tony Woodlief from the Center for Practical Federalism at the State Policy Network about kind of this broad question of whose job is it to help administer programs, help people get out of poverty, and how is some of that responsibility shifting in the coming year or two with some new federal legislation. Before we continue, though, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can access this and previous conversations on a whole range of topics. You can also find us wherever you get your shows. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, if you click the little bell icon on your screen, you'll get a notification each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, all of that and more wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. Tony, you mentioned before the break that the new legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill that reformed the food stamp program, also there's some impacts to states, obviously. And the report that came out for the Alliance for Opportunity and the Center for Practical Federalism touched on some of that. So I want to kind of ask a two-part question. Number one, what should state leaders be aware of that they know, they should know is sort of coming down the pipeline now as this gets implemented, and how should they respond to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So every state is going to have to pick up more of the administrative tab for this program. And that's just across the board. So Utah states with well-run programs like Utah still are going to have a higher expense. The the value of that incentives is that states really had no incentive before to put any manpower or resources into extra eligibility checks because they would have had to foot that bill more or less. So now they've got to foot the bill anyway. They better administer it properly and efficiently. And then, like we talked about, states that have just been sending out checks left and right without any real confirmation that the people should be receiving them. Now they're going to start wearing more of the cost, and that the additional cost of the program that they have to pay is based on how high the error rate is. So that's going to be a challenge. It's going to be especially a challenge in states that maybe they've had tax cuts recently, or they've got school choice programs they've implemented that amounts to an additional spend out of the state treasury. There's going to be real pressure on them. So I think what to be done, it depends. Unfortunately, it shouldn't, but I think it's probably going to depend in part on what party controls what part of the government. I don't think anybody expects California to suddenly clean up its act. My state of North Carolina, you have a Democrat governor who's he's a fan of big government, and he's not, I would say, the straightest shooter. And then you've got a Republican legislature, so they probably shouldn't expect him to suddenly lead the charge to clean everything up, although they could be surprised. He was a former Democrat governor who let the whole thing just kind of fall apart on his watch, which is unsurprising given his governance in other areas. So in that case, if you've got a legislature that has to get in the driver's seat, we would suggest, number one, it's time to get your oversight committees in gear, and whatever committees oversee this particular program, they better get in gear and start getting those administrators of the program in front of them and demand a plan, because they've got limited time, and they could get some outside help if they need it. But if it's your legislature, they got to start holding hearings and demand some interchange and a plan. If it's on the governor's side, if you've got a governor who wants to make changes, I mean, that the research you just mentioned from Alliance for Opportunity that we contributed a little bit to, that's just a blueprint for changes that they could begin making right away. The additional challenge, I'll say, is states that want to do the right thing, they're going to face a hurdle, which is just the work requirements. Some states just have really outdated systems. And unfortunately, some states have thrown a lot of money at very expensive consultancies who never quite give you a simple technology, right? The bill never ends, and you get these complicated legacy systems. And I think some states, that's a little ambush they're going to run into when they try to start implementing the work requirements. And if they're not doing that right, that could trigger other penalties. So it's really a time to get the house in order, which, if we did more of these programs closer to home in the first place, probably would be doing them more efficiently anyway. One would hope, because you got more accountability for a governor and a legislature in a state than you do for unelected bureaucrats, in Washington.
Tony, in the report, it kind of lays out that the requirement for this idea of a state match, essentially states chipping in some of their own state funding to help pay for the benefits going to people on the food stamp program, it breaks it out in a tier that's basically anchored to the error rate that state has. And so the way it works, and I'm just kind of summarizing from the report that, again, we'll include in the show notes so folks can go read it if they'd like to. If your state has below a 6% error rate, there's a 0% match. If your error rate is between 6 and 8, it's a 5% match. If your error rate is between 8 and 10, it's a 10% match. And if your error rate is above 10%, it's a 15% match. So it kind of sounds to me like the federal government is essentially saying, okay, states, because it's sort of a graduated scale, you have a clear incentive to not have high error rates. In other words, run your food stamp program well, states. Be accurate in your eligibility determinations and in your benefit dispersals so that you don't have to invest a certain percentage of your state funds to pay for the benefits of your folks. And so I kind of give that to you and then ask if you're a governor or a legislature looking at this, what do you think will happen, Tony? Could some states that have really high error rates look at this and say, well, we're just going to have a high error rate. We're going to have a high state match. Oh, well. Or is this really going to be an incentive to get states to say, we're going to clean up our act. We're going to be more efficient and effective and accurate. We're going to bring down our error rate.
Well, it's people do respond to incentives, but sometimes in unpredictable ways. So some predictions and some might surprise you. Like another part of that bill that gets neglected is there is a threshold error rate above which you actually get extra time to fix the program. And that's a carve out for the state of Alaska, which has some outlandish error rate. And as a colleague of mine said, they must be sending checks to penguins or something. We have no idea how they could be that far out of whack. But in order to secure the vote, to pass the bill, Alaska got a carve out. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if disastrously run states, like take the state of Illinois, if they have a higher error rate, you have suddenly a built-in incentive to just go ahead and get the error rate even higher and take advantage of that little carve out. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happened with a couple of states. But for other states, it's a matter of, as the report indicates, they can do some things relatively expeditiously depending on how well functioning the state agency is. So some are not. They could do some things to really double down on the eligibility checks pretty quickly and at least begin to drive that error rate down. And people who administer the programs will be quick to tell you, hey, the error rate that gets calculated, it's based on samples. It's not always reliable. Yes, that's all true. But you want to start getting the systems right, because the big driver is we're not checking eligibility the way we should to make sure they still live there, to confirm their income. There's some ways you could do that pretty easily. So that, I think, is the states who really want to get this right. That's what you're going to see pretty quickly. But then they're going to have to wrestle with the functioning of the bureaucracy if it's not a well-run program. Like the state of Utah, you're so blessed in many ways. You just have a really well-functioning state government with, from what I can tell, a lot of collegiality among people. They tend to be public servants in Utah, and they want to do the right thing. But some states do not have that level of efficiency and dedication, unfortunately.
In these conversations, I often find myself sort of touting Utah, and obviously we're not perfect. There's still plenty of areas we can improve, and that's actually one of the things that I love about the mentality in Utah is that the governor or the legislature, our state agencies, there is this spirit of continuous improvement, that even if we're doing really well across a number of metrics, we want to continue to improve and do better. And I think that's why we have done well as a state. And so I give a lot of respect and praise to the folks who make these decisions on the policy side and administer these programs, because there are a lot of good things happening in Utah. And as evidenced in that Alliance for Opportunity report, Utah won't owe a percentage of the state match when it comes to the benefits because of having, again, just a well-run system that administers this stuff well. And so that's maybe to kind of close the loop on that. That's the kind of thing we want to happen at the state level, that states feel like, well, we know it can be done, and so we're going to administer our food stamp program in a way that's accurate. We're going to bring down the error rate so we save some significant state dollars on the benefit match side of things.
Yeah. One other thing, Nick, I'll point out, like one other prediction, I think, is you will see some states get mugged by reality, where it's just going to be on them all of a sudden. The penalty is going to get locked in this year. Your performance rate in 2026 isn't part what will determine your penalties when you have to start paying them. And I think you will see some states that will just let this opportunity for reform, this 1-year window, just slip right by because the legislature isn't necessarily paying attention. The state agency is kind of hunkered down. The governor's attention's elsewhere. I think we're going to see some of that, and which is, it shouldn't be that way, but my hunch is you will see a little bit of it. So that's one of the reasons we're trying to get the word out, so that the public servants in every state who want to do the right thing, they can see, oh, here's the blueprint. We could actually do this. It's not rocket science.
Well, Don, we need to take another quick break. When we come back, I want to sort of come back to this broader question of the need for, the opportunity for, what I might call social safety net federalism. That these parts of this bill seem to be a practical example of, and sort of tie this to the broader discussion we're having as a nation right now about what type of government is really best equipped to run the kinds of programs we want to be effective at alleviating poverty, putting people back on the path to upward mobility, and maybe kind of outline what things we should take away moving forward. How can we continue this sort of pro-work, pro-federalism trend in our social welfare system? So we're going to jump back into all of that right after this break. This is Defending Ideas. Don't go anywhere.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we've been talking with Tony Woodlief with the Center for Practical Federalism at the State Policy Network about some of the changes that states are going to have to implement as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed in 2025, specifically as it refers to the food stamp program. So we're going to jump back into this question about safety net federalism and really this question of whose responsibility is it to really run these programs and help folks get out of poverty. Before we do, again, I want to remind you, if you like this conversation and you want more, visit defendingideas.org. You can get more conversations just like this on a whole range of topics. You can also find us wherever you watch or listen to your shows. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas on your favorite platform and click the subscribe button. Again, all that and more wherever you get your shows or at defendingideas.org. Tony, to round out the conversation, I want to come back to this kind of big picture question we started with at the beginning, this idea of the value of federalism and the virtue of it, and how if we had more federalism across a range of issues, I think we'd be less politically polarized because there would be 50 levels of government making decisions about tough issues rather than one that feels do or die existential. We got to win this election or get this bill passed through Congress. And also just opening it up to innovation where if you have 50 states that are, I would say, constitutionally designed to be laboratories of innovation, to be policy leaders, we could have a lot more creativity around solving tough issues. So I give all that. I'm very cognizant of the skeptics or the folks who are concerned about this. And when it comes to the social welfare system, we've been talking about the food stamp program. There are kind of two, I guess, critiques or questions that I'm sure some skeptics out there could have that I'd love to hear you respond to. And it might be this, that a skeptic or a critic of the idea of safety net federalism might point to the high error rates in some states when it comes to food stamps as evidence of, well, no, states sometimes don't do a great job running these, so we shouldn't push more authority or innovation to the state level. Or even some of the news coverage a little while back about, I believe it was the state of Minnesota with high fraud rates and things like that. So if someone's watching this in the news or hearing these kinds of things and thinking, well, wait, why would we want to push more to the states when there are some problems? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the reason you see this kind of sloppiness in the states is precisely the opposite. It's because the states really didn't have to foot the bill. They didn't want trouble from the feds when they got pressure under Obama and definitely under Biden to look the other way and not confirm eligibility. They didn't want trouble. They don't want to have Department of Justice lawyers showing up and investigating them. And on top of it, what do they care if some extra checks go out? More money gets spent in their state. So it was the opposite. They had no incentive because they were not footing the bill. In some ways, it's sort of the mirror of the program itself. When you perpetuate this generational dependency, why should I look for a job? Somebody else is going to feed me. Somebody else has got to provide me housing. And you kind of take away the dignity. So I think that federalism would indicate, and that's the attempt here with this OB3. It's small, but it's important. It's an attempt to get the people who have to administer the program to foot the bill, so they have an incentive to do it properly. And so then the broader question with federalism is: do we really need to collect money from every working person and business in this country and send it to Washington, D.C. for Washington, D.C. to take a cut and attach rules to it and then send it right back to the states to feed the hungry. Is that really the best way to feed the hungry in this country? Because it seems like the opposite of the best way, you know? I mean, the way many of us were brought up, if you see someone hungry, you feed them. And that's generally how we took care of people for the longest time. In many communities, we still do. I'm sure your church, my church, you know, we have a pantry. We give alms. We give money to help the poor. You know, we support a kitchen. Like that's where it should begin. Instead of trying to get Washington to do it, that's just insanity. It seems to me, because then you're involved in people's lives when you're doing it in community. You know.
Tony, there's something that comes to mind as you're talking, and it's actually making me reflect on the way I talk about this issue. I very recently was in Washington, D.C. for the Alliance for Opportunity Meant for More Summit, fantastic event, and had some other convenings while I was out there with American Enterprise Institute, for example, and just a lot of great groups and people on the national level working on these issues to try and improve our social welfare system and having these conversations about how do we have states have more of a leadership role. And I've spoken at a number of these events, and I think I've often used the language of, well, we need more state flexibility as sort of a shorthand, but this conversation is making me kind of rethink the framing to say that instead of just saying, well, we need just more federalism, more state flexibility, so don't frame it as, we just need to let states kind of do whatever they want and let the chips fall where they may, because that leads to the concerns of folks like, well, some states are not going to administer these things well. And so should we reframe this to say we want accountable federalism? And maybe that's adding a modifier. You all have the Center for Practical Federalism, but is a different way to think about it that, yes, we want federalism, but we need transparency, we need accountability, and maybe instead of just saying flexibility, we need to empower states to be innovators, which flexibility means just maybe loosening the rules, but innovation means empowering states to think creatively in pursuit of a better objective. Are these the kinds of ways maybe we should be talking about this?
Right. I think if you take the Minnesota example, or any state that administers a program poorly and allows corruption, the bet with federalism is if the taxpayers of the state actually have to foot the bill, there's more of a penalty. But with this program, it's all we taxpayers who foot the bill for one state's corruption or incompetence. And so federalism is the first step to get more accountability. And then, of course, many of us believe ideally you'd push the authority even further down in communities, because it's just the closer you live to the people making the decision, the easier they are to hold accountable. But that as long as the bill is paid by some bureaucracy in Washington, it's almost a point of pride for some states and politicians to milk as much as they can out of the program and not worry at all about how it gets spent, which is the opposite of good governance.
Tony, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and obviously these are really deep issues that we can spend hours and hours and hours on. I think many state leaders in the coming years will be doing that as they're looking at how to implement all this stuff. But maybe one also broad question, because as I think about the opportunity to push for more responsible federalism, accountable, practical federalism in the right way that you're kind of articulating in this report from Alliance for Opportunity that, again, we'll link to in the show notes, in the way that this outlines it, one of the big questions on my mind is where are we missing the intellectual framework or the arguments for this kind of brand of responsible, innovative, safety net federalism? Where do we miss some intellectual support for making that case? What can state level policy voices do to fill that gap? How do we essentially make this a cohesive message that is evidence-based and really is compelling that this is the right direction for our country?
Yeah, it's we've created some perverse incentives where we've asked Washington D.C. to do things that are not in its enumerated powers and to take that burden off of states, direct burden off states. Well, of course, we in the states are still paying the bill, but our state government, isn't taxing us. And somehow that's supposed to be a triumph. And so I think the honest answer, Nick, is, and you see this in Utah, I mean, maybe more than any other state, we have to demand that our state leaders both at the state level and the ones we send to Washington to represent us. We've got to demand that they are the voice for federalism, that they are going to Washington and saying, you know what, no more of this. We want our federal taxes lower, and we, the states, will take on these responsibilities again. And that means having the courage in the states to generate the revenue to do that. But I think that's the courageous decision that has to happen, because as long as we allow state leaders to foist all these responsibilities off to DC so they can keep our taxes seemingly low, right? The federal government will eat us out of house and home and drive us into, national unrecoverable debt along the way. So we've got to demand from our representatives that they are defending federalism, both here and in DC.
Well, Tony, maybe to try and kind of put a ribbon on that, so to speak, is I've spent a lot of time over my career either working in or around state level government, and it's pretty easy to witness, at least here in Utah and presumably throughout the country as well, that the folks who can show up to a committee meeting at the legislature or join virtually if they can't be there in person, or even find time to reach out and interact with their lawmakers. I've seen that impact the way legislators at the state level think about an issue and at times vote on an issue. And so if a Utahn has a gripe about something, they know who to call and where to go. And I've seen it have an impact, make a difference. It's so much harder to do that at the federal level. So just this plug for states being in the driver's seat more often on these issues, with accountability, with a spirit of innovation, and with a pro-work objective in mind for true upward mobility, I gotta believe that's going to help solve so many of these issues we grapple with as a nation. And so I hope that the work continues and the Center for Practical Federalism can continue to beat this drum, and we, of course, do what we can here at Sutherland from Utah.
Oh, y'all are doing a great job, and we like working with you. So thanks for having me on today.
Well, the feeling is mutual. And Tony, thank you again so much for your time and expertise on this issue. We'll continue to watch this and talk about it as it unfolds and as states implement these changes. And of course, the whole other range of policy issues where we discuss the need for more federalism. So again, that's Tony Woodlief with the Center for Practical Federalism, the State Policy Network. Tony, thanks again so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nick.
We're going to take a final break before we leave you all with our talking points for this episode. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, and thanks again to Tony Woodlief from the Center for Practical Federalism at the State Policy Network for sharing his time and expertise. Look, in the coming years, there's going to be a lot of debate over whose responsibility it is to run and improve social welfare programs. This debate is going to happen between the federal government and the states. Here are some talking points that we can use when we end up in these conversations. First, I think broadly speaking, more federalism, meaning more responsibility and authority pulled away from Washington, D.C. and pushed to the states, will have policy and political benefits. One, it'll open up more capacity for creative problem solving by leveraging the 50 laboratories of innovation, the states. And it'll reduce our political polarization because these issues won't feel so intractable and existential, which is almost always the result when they're only decided at the federal level. Second, at the federal level, we have more than 80 safety net programs administered through multiple federal agencies that all report to various congressional committees, spending well over $1 trillion a year. This is not a system designed for efficiency, accuracy, and good outcomes in helping more of our fellow Americans escape poverty and pursue the American dream. Leveraging the innovation of states will help us fix the fissures in the existing social safety net in ways that'll be increasingly necessary in the coming years. And third, I know there's a lot of consternation at times when people hear about giving states flexibility. Many are worried that states may not actually run things well. So that's why a key message point from this conversation is that rather than purely flexibility, which implies maybe simply just loosening rules, we need innovation authority, which is a brand of accountable federalism that empowers states to creatively innovate to solve specific problems. This creates guardrails against fraud, waste, abuse, or simply lackluster management of safety net programs, while still leveraging the positive aspects of federalism to improve how we help people escape poverty in this country. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.